Aloha, top of the morning, friends and family. Earlier this week, we did a video saying that ball pythons are not picky feeders, and it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek type of video because of the fact that sometimes ball pythons can actually be pretty picky feeders, and really any snake for that matter can be a picky feeder. So in today's video, we're going to talk about some of the reasons that your snake could be a picky feeder, as well as go over some tips and tricks to get past that picky feeder and get them eating again. Now, it will be kind of geared towards ball pythons because that is the snake that I have the most experience working with being a picky feeder, but really the tips and tricks here should be good for just about any species of snake and even reptile for that matter. So whatever species it is you're working with, this video should be helpful. There are 5 different categories that we're going to go over for why a snake might be a picky feeder. And those categories are 1, husbandry, 2, seasonal, 3, prey item, 4, stress and surroundings, and 5, health. Let's talk about husbandry first. So that's potentially the most important one. Temperatures and humidity. It might seem like a no-brainer for some of you, but sometimes that's often the case, is that either your humidity is off or your temperature is off. Now for ball pythons, your humidity is somewhere between 55 to 60%, as well as a hot spot, somewhere between 89, maybe 92, depending on male or female. Ambient temperatures as well. Just you want to make sure that your temperatures are good for your species that you're keeping. You might look at the native habitat where they're from and see what the temperature ranges are there. Make sure you're monitoring those temperatures accurately. Having a temp gun to actually temp the area versus a ambient temperature thermometer. Those little temp guns, I say are like the best things for a reptile keeper. If you don't have one of those little infrared temp guns, you should have one. You should have multiple, maybe even as a reptile keeper, so that you always have one. You can temp the animal itself. You can temp the enclosure. Temperature and humidity are some of the biggest factors as to maybe why your snake is not eating. The second factor after temperature and humidity is going to be security. If your animal does not feel safe, it is not going to eat most of the time. So you want to make sure you have nice hides, and just the enclosure should feel secure. They shouldn't feel like they're open or threatened. Snakes, it's very counterintuitive for a lot of folks. You think you want this big open enclosure, but the snake does not want to be open. The snake wants to be huddled up against something and tucked inside something safe. Every time I've had a snake get out my entire life, it always goes to look for the darkest and smallest little space it can cram itself into, and that's just where they feel comfortable. So if you don't have good hides and a good spot for them to feel safe, that could be another reason that you have a picky feeder on your hands. The third reason within husbandry could be lighting. If it's too bright, if they don't have access to that darkness that they might require, especially talking about snakes, then you want to address that. If they don't have an opportunity, it's similar to the hide. If they're not able to get into a nice dark spot and it's just too bright all the time, that could be another reason. All right, let's talk about the seasonal reasons. And this could be seasonal for any species, but when we're talking about ball pythons, some ball pythons could, especially males, go off prey during breeding season, and that's not uncommon. Also females, if they're getting ready to produce eggs, they're getting ready to ovulate, they're going through those different cycles, then that can cause them to go off of food as well. And you don't really need to worry about any type of intervention in these situations unless they start to have a significant weight loss. But times like this are normal. I've had so many snakes during breeding season, they kind of stop eating, and that's been okay. Let's talk about prey items. Some snakes are just picky about what they eat. So here's some things to consider. Live versus frozen thawed. Some snakes want live, some snakes want frozen thawed. In my experience, I've gotten every single snake in here, which I've got about 70 snakes in this room. All of them will take frozen thawed. But a lot of them I started that way, so it could be a hard switch. I think that it is possible to switch just about any animal from live to frozen thawed, but that is something that you might consider. Some of the snakes, when I get them started, are very hard up to start on frozen thawed, and I've broken and gotten them started on live, but then was able to switch them over to frozen thawed. But live versus frozen thawed is something to consider. Some snakes you might even find are more willing to take frozen thawed versus live. So it seems counterintuitive, but it is a thing. Now, the prey type makes a difference, whether that's a quail or mouse versus a rat, especially. Mice smell differently than rats. Rats smell differently than mice. Some snakes are used to mice. Some snakes might not want to take a rat. I've got a Burmese python here that could definitely take down a rabbit, but only has ever wanted rats. So I just give her big jumbo rats, and that's what she eats. I've had times in the past where I've actually tied a rat to a rabbit's face. Frozen thawed, they weren't alive, but I literally sewed the back of the rat to the face of the rabbit to get some of my reticulated pythons switched over to rabbits, because retics, especially the females, trying to keep them going on rats is a big ask. So I really wanted to switch them over to rabbits. So that's another thing to think about, is the scenting. Just the scent, like if a snake really is on mice, but you want it to eat rats, you might consider scenting those rats with mouse smell, and that could really get them going and eventually have them switch over to the prey item that you want them to be on. Prey size is another thing to look at. I've got snakes here that if I feed them one that's slightly too big, they're just not into it, and they might even strike it, wrap it, and then just leave it because they think, that's bigger than I want to handle. So you don't want to feed too small all the time, because you want them to be able to get all the nutrients they need. But I find often that if you give something that's a little bigger than they want, then they'll leave it alone, versus if you give them a smaller meal, they'll definitely eat it. So prey size is another thing to consider. And let's talk about stress and surroundings. Often, too much handling before feeding can cause the snake to not feel secure and maybe a little extra stressed out. If I'm planning to feed, I definitely don't go around handling any of my snakes on feeding day. Very often, if you are handling a snake too much during the same day that you're feeding, they're not going to feel secure, and that goes back to that security thing in their surroundings and their stress level. And just handling during feeding day is just something I would avoid altogether. And speaking of surroundings, a new snake might need to say you just got a snake from either Morph Market or from Palmstreet. If you haven't checked out Palmstreet, they have people selling ball pythons on there now. It's a new thing for them, but I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's a pretty sweet little deal they got going on there. Whether you got your snake from Morph Market, whether you got your snake from the Palmstreet live auction, a new snake going into a new enclosure is going to maybe need time to settle in. Or even if you switched enclosures from one to another, that their surroundings and they're not used to them, you might need to give them some time to settle in. Whether that's a couple days, whether that's a week, maybe it's a couple weeks. So every snake is different, so some take longer than others to settle into their surroundings. So that's one thing to consider as well. Also, maybe even consider, where is your enclosure located in your house? All my snakes are down here in the snake room, and they're not really experiencing a whole lot of outside noise and commotion, especially they got 4 kids running around upstairs all the time. They're not in this room very often. It's usually they're nice and peaceful and in solitude down here. And so they're usually ready to eat. But if you had your snake in your living room and there's constant commotion, people running around, and you got a big open enclosure that can be seen from all sides, and that could be a factor. Consider, where is your snake in your house? Where is the enclosure? Is there a lot of traffic? Are they not feeling secure? They need to feel secure, and that's going to give you the best chance of having a snake that wants to eat all the time. Let's talk a little bit about health. If a snake has any kind of respiratory issue or maybe internal parasites, that's a big bummer, first of all, but also, if you notice any kind of dripping from the mouth, any discharge whatsoever, discoloration around the nostrils, things of that nature where they might have a respiratory infection, that's definitely going to drive them off food. And if they have a respiratory infection, that's a sign of something that's been there already and it's really coming to fruition. And that's immediate trip to a vet to get some kind of culture done to find out what is the problem, what's causing the infection. But that's something that's going to throw them off of food for sure. Parasites too. If your snake is captive born and bred, the chance of it having parasites is pretty low. Maybe your animal is one that was wild caught and came in from there, in which case it could have parasites, and you definitely need to take it through a deworming process or parasite cleansing process to help give them the best chance at survival in captivity. Another thing that's really common health-wise is when they're going into shed. Many snakes, when they are going into shed, especially in that cycle where their eyes are getting really cloudy and they can't see very well, that's going to be a time when they go off food. Just wait for that shed cycle to be over, wait for them to shed out, and then try offering it again. And all this talk about feeding, we should definitely mention that if your snake is losing weight and consistently, it might be time for an immediate vet trip to find out what's going on, because a picky feeder is one thing that's not eating every time you offer, but if a snake is off food for so long that it eventually starts losing body mass and significant weight, then you want to curtail that as soon as possible, because it's not sustainable for a snake. Even though they are great at energy conservation, being cold-blooded creatures, losing too much weight for too long a period of time is going to be very concerning and not something you want your snake to have to go through. All right, now we discussed some of these throughout the video already, but I'm going to go over some of the troubleshooting and tips that might help you if you do have a picky feeder. One thing would be to try at night. Like we talked about with having too much light, feed in very low light, turn all the lights off so that you can barely see anything. Heat the rodent up a little bit maybe, because in that darkness they can see the heat signature off of the prey item. And yeah, feeding in the dark, if you got a picky eater, that can be a really helpful thing. As I mentioned earlier with the rat and rodent thing and the rabbit, like scenting the prey item with whatever it is that they were used to, if you're trying to switch them over to something, or if you just, if you have an animal that's usually eating lizards in the wild or something, just any kind of scenting that you can do to entice them to eat the food that they don't seem to be wanting to eat is another tip that you can try out. As I mentioned a second ago, if you're like switching from live to frozen thawed, really warming up the prey items. If you watched this last week's video, you saw that most of my snakes ate without even the prey item being warmed up. That's because they're used to frozen thawed and they're generally good eaters and they're in pretty ideal conditions down here in the snake room. So that's fortunate for me, but if you're having that issue, I generally warm them up. The only reason I didn't warm them up in that last video is because my little heat gun is loud and I didn't want it to be there for video purposes, and I was just setting myself up for failure with the ball pythons are not picky feeders video, really to just drive home the fact that even though my situation was not ideal, that they're generally good eaters. The last troubleshooting tip is one that seems to be the hardest for most people, which is be patient. As I mentioned, like these snakes can go for a long time without food. They don't need as much food as we might think they do in captivity. So if your snake has gone off food for a little bit, especially if it's during breeding season or something, but you just got to be patient. A few weeks without eating isn't a death sentence for a snake by any means. So, sometimes you just got to outweight them, and sometimes people can get very stressed out, like it hasn't eaten in 2 days, and it's like, oh, that's fine. Like talk to me in 2 months. But again, if they're not losing weight, really just patience is going to be one of your biggest factors, along with all the other little tips that I just mentioned. I'd just like to reiterate that having a picky eating snake or a picky eating animal is not uncommon. So don't stress yourself out too much if you have an animal like that. You'll be able to get through it, I think. I'd love for you to leave a comment below and let me know any tips or tricks that I may have missed that you've used if you had a picky feeder, or any maybe other video resources. Leave links in the comments below where people can explore and see different ideas. I've got a few videos where I've given some other tips and tricks of getting baby ball python started on food, and so I'll leave those down there as well. If you got any kind of help from this video, consider subscribing. It's free. It really helps out the channel. And thank you guys for watching. We'll see you on the next video. Aloha.